In 1800, bread was literally a matter of life and death for the working class in Europe. By Kakak, where crop fluctuations often led to revolutions and famines. This transition from a wild grass in the Fertile Crescent to the backbone of civilization transformed humanity more than any other crop in history. However, the story of wheat does not begin in bakeries or organized fields. It begins in the Fertile Crescent about 12,000 years ago. Early humans discovered something, growing wild and fertile lands, tall, grass with ears rich in seeds. They harvested it, ground it, and tasted something humans had never experienced in this form before, a storable source of energy, which provided us with our first permanent stability in history. For thousands of years, wheat was the silent engine of human migration. People moved from place to place following harvest seasons. There was no global trade or nations, only small groups following the cycle of nature. Wheat spread slowly across the Middle East and Europe, generation after generation, through exploration and agricultural expansion. By roughly 5000 BC, wheat had reached most parts of the Old World, and there everything changed. Early farmers did not just collect seeds, nor they learned how to select the best varieties, plant them in rows, and protect them from weeds. They called it yellow gold, and the name that became synonymous with wealth in many cultures. For the first time in history, it became possible to store surplus food. Humans were no longer tethered to daily hunting. Wheat invented the concept of surplus. Ancient texts in Sumer and Egypt describe it with deep reverence, and leaders throughout the ancient world began using it as currency too. Collect taxes and pay the wages of the laborers who built the pyramids and ziggurats. Wheat was sacred. As empires began to emerge, leaders realized that an army without wheat could not win a war. Yet, even with this spread, wheat remained tied to the climate. It was expensive to transport, limited by harvest seasons, and far from affecting daily life in regions unsuitable for cultivation. When wheat emerged as a commodity in the Roman Empire, it was sold via complex trade routes to ensure Rome's survival. Roman administrators described it as the state's lifeline. The loaf of bread was the measure that determined the stability of the empire. Wheat was not just food, it was politics, and it remained so for thousands of years. The people who unleashed the true potential of wheat were the farmers and engineers of the Middle Ages and beyond. They developed techniques for milling grain using watermills and windmills, creating finer and more durable flour. They built mills everywhere, grew wheat wherever the climate allowed, and began trading grain across continents. By the time the agricultural revolution began in Europe, wheat had become a foundation for cooking, medicine, and the economy. The world tasted wheat and relied upon it. They called it daily bread. Brick merchants began transporting tons of it across the oceans. Major ports, such as London and later New York, became gateways for wheat to the world. Merchants imported wheat from distant territories, processed it in their own mills, and sold it worldwide at fluctuating prices. For centuries, certain nations monopolized the wheat trade, and the profits were equivalent to the fortunes of kings. In the Middle Ages, wheat was treated the way we treat energy today. Wheat fields were seen as proof of a state's power. Kings kept detailed stocks of wheat, the way modern governments track monetary reserves. If you possessed wheat, you possessed power. If you did not, you were at the mercy of the market. However, there was a problem. Wheat requires specific soil and climate conditions. Global demand was rising dramatically, but the supply chain relied entirely on trade routes that were expensive and unreliable. This is the part of wheat's history that most people do not learn, and it is the part that shaped the modern world more than almost anything else. In recent centuries, nations began expanding to grow wheat in vast areas, such as the Great Plains in America and Australia. They discovered that these lands were the world's bread baskets. Farmers created massive wheat farms and needed labor and machinery. At first, they used grueling manual labor. Then came the machine. Wheat farming became an industry. Growing, harvesting, and processing wheat required vast spaces and advanced technologies. The great wheat farms became a testing ground for what would become the most efficient production systems in history. As agricultural machinery spread, production became global. The world's climate, soil, and demand were insatiable. The process of making bread itself was a technological evolution. After harvesting the wheat, farmers had to transport it to massive mills within days before it spoiled. The mills were powered by steam, then electricity, and operated around the clock. Factory workers became part of a massive production machine. The danger was constant, and production never ceased. What followed was an explosion in wheat production that reshaped the world. Nations raced to establish wheat-producing zones everywhere. The United States, Canada, Ukraine, and Russia became wheat factories. By the 20th century, wheat was the most valuable commodity in global empires, more valuable than any other crop. The human cost was significant. The expansion of wheat cultivation required social and political shifts. Millions were forced to change their lifestyle to work in wheat production. Conditions were harsh, and profits were calculated based on efficiency. The world did not just benefit from wheat. Wheat drove politics. It was the economic engine that made the grain trade profitable. This decision seemed small at first. A farmer choosing wheat over other crops. But it established a system that defined the global economy for centuries. By the 20th century, wheat became the most traded commodity in the world, more valuable than any other. Profits built massive cities. They funded wars. Every corner of the world relied on the wheat trade. The world became obsessed. Wheat shifted from the staple to something the middle class expected on their table daily. This was no accident. Merchants and politicians actively pushed for wheat consumption because the countries that produced it controlled global food security. But this reliance created something nations did not expect: resistance. In regions dependent on wheat, crises led to revolutions. In the end, the wheat in your hands today carries a long history of politics, economics, and genetic modification. We did not domesticate wheat. Rather, wheat has entirely altered our way of life. It is a story that began in the fields of the Middle East and continues today in our struggle with health and productivity.